Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the disqualification of Trump by the Colorado Supreme Court, cancellation of Santa, the beheading of Satan, and a few recommendations from the editors for what books and films that they enjoyed in 2023. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Nina Power, and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. This week, a ruling of the Colorado Supreme Court came down. The decision held that under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, Donald Trump isn't qualified to run for president. He was judged automatically guilty of insurrection, which is a crime he has never been convicted of. But under a novel legal theory proposed by two originalist legal scholars, William Bowd and Michael Stokes Paulson, Trump was deemed ineligible to run for office. I don't think many people who are following this controversy are aware that Michael Stokes Paulson became known in a more minor way years ago for being the first scholar of any prominence to propose that the 14th Amendment banned abortion. But that is an earlier version of this kind of originalist argument regarding the 14th Amendment that Paulson has offered. That one hasn't taken off. His argument that the 14th Amendment means that you must vote for either Nikki Haley or Joe Biden has taken off. We published Alan Dershowitz in August on this theory when it was first proposed by Bowden Paulson. His article, No, the 14th Amendment Doesn't Disqualify Trump, is available at compactmag.com. And then this week we published a essay by Samuel Moyn, professor of law at Yale, titled The Liberal Plot Against Democracy. Sohrab, what's Moyn's argument?
So Samuel Moyn, the great progressive legal scholar, argues that we should pay less attention to the sort of legal details of the Colorado ruling than to the sort of political meaning of it. He does get into the law somewhat, but the political meaning of it is that this is the latest attempt by liberals and never Trump conservatives to circumvent the ballot box by trying to have a supposedly neutral, apolitical constitution and a sort of magically redemptive and equally supposedly non-political neutral Supreme Court act as a sort of talisman against Trump, as a way to get around the more difficult small d democratic responsibility of winning over and forging durable democratic majorities. That's his basic argument. And he argues that really this began with Trump's election in 2016, the response to which was, this can't be happening. We must use, the FBI, law enforcement, every element of American state power to undo this outcome. It culminated, Moyn says, in the Mueller investigation into supposed collusion. You'll recall the headline finding of the Mueller probe was that there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. At that point, Samuel Moyn says, people opposed to Trump, whether leftists, liberals, or never Trumpers, face two options. They could either say, okay, well, this is reality. Now we're going to try to unseat Trump by winning a durable, large enough majority, or they could try for more, what he calls legal hijinks. Unfortunately, they chose more legal hijinks, impeachment 1, impeachment 2, et cetera, et cetera. He argues this Colorado ruling is just one more version of the same, except it's really, really far more dangerous than perhaps any of the previous ones, because, the possibility that Trump won't get to be on the ballot so vacuums the sense of legitimacy out of whatever election we might have in 2024 that, as he says, the court may just have dug the grave of our democracy.
It's a 4-3 decision. All of the judges voting were appointed by Democrats. The 4 who voted that Trump is disqualified attended Ivy League law schools. The 3 who voted that he isn't disqualified attended law school at the University of Denver. That's a relevant difference, probably the decisive difference in this case. This is most likely going to be overturned by the Supreme Court. All right, this was always a reach, but as Jason Willick has argued in the Washington Post, it wasn't that many months ago that this was viewed as a really, really fringe legal theory. The idea of deeming Trump ineligible because he automatically insurrected, the automatic determination of insurrection was very, very fringe, and it's moved rapidly into the mainstream. I think there is a parallel to be drawn here between this proposal and the proposal by which John Eastman sought to secure Trump's election through slates of alternate electors. That, too, is a fringe legal theory. That, too, was implausible and democratically dangerous. But it was textually, and this is what very few people who are even know the name John Eastman are aware of. Textually speaking, Eastman's theory held up a lot better than you'd think. I'm not saying I found it finally persuasive. I didn't. I mean, Eastman raised some important questions, but his theory finally kind of asserted that the vice president who counts the votes could kind of determine which votes count. Given that a vice president will often be running for president, it seems kind of zany that he'd be able to just sort of elect himself potentially, or Kamala, right? Could be she. But if you actually look at the relevant texts, the Eastman theory made a lot more sense than just on its face it would seem to make. Something very similar is true of the Paulson-Bowd. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing the name Bowd. The Paulson-Bowd proposal. And politically and practically speaking, pretty insane, and democratically speaking, quite dangerous. But can you make an argument off the basis of certain texts that it holds up? Sure, you can make the argument. And Michael Stokes Paulson whose work I know better than Bowd's, is a really, really sharp legal mind. People on both sides of the aisle need to, as Moyne argues, they need to try to build majorities. Okay, instead of trying to run the country off of readings of paper that are politically huge reaches. And I really hope we can kind of get back on that track as a country. And so this Colorado ruling is likely to be overturned by the Supreme Court. But the important thing to understand is that it's only one small part of a broader and broader effort to deny the American people a free choice between two candidates. It's not too much to say that. One of the troubling elements of this is the criminal cases brought against Trump. Now, there's something tragic in this. There are conflicting goods. Some of the criminal cases have raised legitimate questions. They're worth investigating, discussing. When a criminal case has been brought against someone, standard and makes certain sense to limit his ability to attack, say, judges or prosecutors in the media. That generally makes sense. But when that person is a leading presidential candidate, by bringing a prosecution against them, you've created a situation in which a legal prosecution is profoundly shaping the race, and the candidate who's running barred in certain important ways from addressing that prosecution. He may be barred from calling it, a witch hunt or something in which the fix is in. He might be restrained from discussing it freely. And though that makes good sense in their legal terms, I think it is and should seem unsettling in broader political terms to have a candidate barred from discussing something that has a really direct bearing on the race. And so certain steps that have been taken and actually can't be undone at this moment have created a very fraught situation for the country going through 2024. And it would be good to see this diffused to whatever extent it can be. Avoiding legal escalation would be good. One thing that Jack Goldsmith, a professor of law at Harvard, observed, after he wrote an article for the New York Times pointing to just some of these problems with the prosecution of Trump. In a follow-up, government lawyers every day decline to bring charges against people for real crimes because the harms to the community of doing so would be greater than the benefits. I'm not asserting that that's the case with Trump. I'm not really in a position to, so I'm not going to weigh all the facts. People, including listeners to this podcast, have wildly differing views of Trump, and I'm not here to settle all that. But that element of discretion, combined with the fact that the Biden Justice Department initially delayed prosecution of Trump, as has been reported by the Washington Post, and then rushed it as it became clear that Trump would be the Republican nominee, raises some troubling questions about the appearance of a partisan motive in all this. I'm going to get off my soapbox here. If anyone else has anything to say, please let's get it.
One thing that I've seen a few commentaries note is this century began with a Supreme Court case that intervened in and determined the outcome of an election, which is, of course, Bush v. Gore. And obviously, there are many ways these cases are not similar. What is notable here is just 23 years ago, this was a dramatic and traumatic moment in which it would seem that the judiciary inserted itself in the democratic process and, decisively subverted it. And so, we are in an interesting point insofar as, this moment sort of puts attempts to legally disqualify or prevent Trump from taking office again is, part of really a kind of large scale onslaught of the sort that we just haven't really seen before. It is good to publish someone from the left, Samuel Moyn, who is remaining consistent with the position that people generally took in 2000, which was that the judiciary inserting itself in this process in the way that it did was illegitimate and also was highly damaging to democratic processes in general. It has been at least somewhat heartening to see not just Moyn, but other both prominent liberal and left pundits reacting with some disgust to this Colorado decision. I'm not entirely disheartened that this sort of the principles that informed thinking about the Bush v. Gore decision have been entirely thrown out the window. It's been actually somewhat encouraging to see how many people have immediately made critical statements about this decision. I don't know. I was actually somewhat pleasantly surprised by that fact.
There's a certain tragic element to Samuel Moyn's essay for Compact. Again, the liberal plot against democracy at compactmag.com. Take a look. It's a really powerful piece. The tragic element of it is he's just constantly telling liberals, imagine instead of turning every election every national issue into a kind of police procedural of investigating if there was wrongdoing and were the Russians really behind the fact that people are angry in this country. Imagine instead of doing that, Democrats offered an expansive, attractive vision and put it up against Trump's. And there's something so romantic and so quaint about that. And you yearn for that when you read that, whatever that vision might be. I don't know, say, are we going to go super green? Are we going to shore up the welfare state? Are we going to do whatever the left wants to do, but just lay it on the table and have a clash of visions, as we're supposed to do, instead of reducing everything to something that has to be solved by the police apparatus, by the judicial apparatus. And, and this is a kind of almost universal phenomenon across the developed world. Let's not forget the initial response to Brexit from the British establishment was that this was a Russian hoax, or the Russians' collusion had happened, and various Brexiteer activists had their lives dragged through the mud and careers destroyed before the establishment finally gave way. At least the British establishment did finally give way to Brexit. With Trump, clearly the American one hasn't. In Europe, it happens all the time. People vote in a party that the EU establishment doesn't like. The answer by local Democrats and their Brussels allies isn't to put forward a more attractive vision, is to try to bring to bear sanctions against, the government that's just been elected for the crime of being elected. This is really, really, really tiresome and dangerous. I feel like someone in the liberal hive mind must understand that this is going to bring forth the fascism they fear somehow, but it doesn't stop them. I mean, it's really repressive and enduring large supermajority. Can you try to win that? That's what elections are about.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick note on the Brexit comparison. Yeah, I mean, I agree. It was, a democratic plebiscite, a simple yes/no vote, and the number of people who didn't accept the 52% vote to leave was extraordinary, politically, psychologically, socially, and so on. And exactly this kind of pattern of, no, we're the good guys. We've got the best ideas. You just have to vote for us, even though we're attacking you and calling you deplorables. And, we're not actually defending your interests, and we haven't presented a better vision. It's just we're the PMC, and, therefore we're the good guys and everyone else is a fascist or bad. And we couldn't possibly enter into coalition or accept the outcome of a democratic vote. It's extraordinary. It's really authoritarian and completely damaging to the system and the very idea of democracy. The idea that you could preemptively disqualify your opponents or refuse to enter into dialogue or into politics. We saw this recently with Geert Wilders, and like you say, other countries in Europe, on the idea that some people and some views and some positions, no matter how popular, are simply unacceptable and must be stopped at all costs, even if it means, like in the Colorado ruling, almost like making a claim that someone has committed a crime, even though they haven't been tried, let alone found guilty for it. This is just slander. This is just a denunciation, right? It's just pure it's not playing fair and is completely anti-democratic. Yeah, I think we should absolutely notice and recognize these contours and try to think about how to understand in the first place what is happening everywhere.
In other news, look, America, it's just an incredible country. It's an incredible country. And that's what this segment is about. We have two things. One, Santa. Santa was canceled in the town of Sag Harbor, New York. A village, had a Christmas celebration, supplied a elderly, bearded man with an estimable paunch, had been chosen to serve as Santa. However, his friend had brought him to a briefing by the American Jewish Committee at the local synagogue. And at that synagogue, the man, Ken Dorff, asked a series of critical, not to say maybe hostile questions. Dorff, has studied up on the Israel-Palestine conflict and was, got a little heated in the defense of his views. So it seems that some people at the local synagogue felt that his selection as the local town Santa was divisive, and the town decided to move on from Kris Kringle. This is cancel culture, undeniably. He was canceled. Depending on how hysterical you want to be, you could say that the Israel lobby canceled Kris Kringle. But I have to say that I love this. I think it's good. Talk a lot about cancel culture, but, a small town, elected officials there making a determination about kind of preserving civic harmony. I think this is basically just small town Americana in action. Not to say that, Dorff may not have reasons, just reasons to, feel resentment, but this is just the way that life works. And I don't think this wasn't done through an unaccountable bureaucracy. This is about kind of preserving a kind of civic peace. And what really makes it beautiful for me is that you have people at the town synagogue kind of weighing in decisively on a Christmas display, and far from that being inappropriate, because Christmas is a Christian feast, the feast of the incarnation of our Lord. I think it's really fitting because Christmas, as here understood, is more of a kind of an American civic holiday that's kind of like very soft focused Judeo-Christian. I think to be Santa in a kind of small town Christmas display, you've got to you do have to have buy-in from. It's not about can you delivered correct answers to the Baltimore Catechism. It's more about having buy-in from all the different sectors of American life. So I just sort of wanted to celebrate this as legible and kind of just outcome, given our kind of goofy civic religion. Others may have different views. Maybe somebody really wants to stand up for Ken Dorff, or as I call him, Kris Kringle.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is this is kind of original Tocquevillian cancel culture.
Sort of. I find it just too amusing to offer any criticism above all. I don't have it within me to criticize this.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think it's, it is interesting what you say that this is, it is happening on a small scale of sort of, civic society, small town civic society.
I just find that less malign than the goings on at some Fortune 500 company, or never mind the Ivy League schools. So,
no, I think this is an interesting point. I mean, it does. I brought up the Tocquevillian point because this is sometimes brought up as is there really anything new about cancel culture?
Democratic conformity is
Yeah, Tocqueville's descriptions of sort of small town American life suggest, there were these kinds of pressures, and that perhaps there is something salutary about them. I think it does raise worthwhile questions about what exactly it is that we object to. Obviously, in a democratic culture, what that means is that there will be these kind of pressures towards a kind of conformity or norm that you have to adhere to in order to occupy a place in public life. That there is a version of that that's highly normal across societies. Societies in which the right to deviate from that are actually relatively rare and unusual. So, I mean, I agree that this raises some interesting, deeper questions about what exactly we mean when we talk about cancel culture.
Other news, Michael Cassidy, a former candidate for Congress in Mississippi, went to the Iowa State House and beheaded a statue of Satan, I think going under the moniker Baphomet, that had been put in by the Satanic Temple For those who aren't American and are confused by this story, we have a tradition of holiday Christmas displays. So you put up the nativity scene, and then beginning in the 60s, courts started saying, no, that's a little bit exclusive. Maybe throw a menorah in there. You might get a kind of Kwanzaa thing. And then soon enough, the Satanic Temple said, well, we're a religion too. Let's get Satan in there. That display is intended to offend, and it does offend. Michael Cassidy, former congressional candidate in Mississippi, went to the Iowa State House with a sword and took the head of the statue off. I've seen Cassidy denounced as a Christian nationalist, and this is a kind of sign of dangerous radicalism on the right. I, again, tend to think this is mostly a quaint story of just America doing its thing. Don't see anything dark in it. One point I'll just bring up to add an angle to the story that I think few of our listeners are aware of. Michael Cassidy had an interesting campaign for U.S. Congress. He ran on a program that was, morally conservative, anti-abortion, opposed to LGBT causes, but he also had a remarkable social spending program. Cassidy endorsed Medicare for All, a $20,000 bonus to newlyweds repayable in case of divorce, a $250 monthly stipend for children under 10 rising to $500 a month for children between 10 and 17, and 5-year maternal leave. Cassidy, a former naval pilot, is an interesting figure. He's a guy who wants to kind of turn up the welfare state to 11 in sort of family-friendly terms, and he's also beheading Satan. I don't kind of really know. I don't know where his head is at right now, but he's definitely one of the more interesting minor figures in American politics over the last 24 months or so, between this congressional campaign in which he at least initially pushed a really kind of generous social spending package. We covered this, by the way, at Compact in a story titled "The GOP's War on Economic Populists." I interviewed Cassidy for that story.
Wait. This is the same Cassidy?
Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
The one you wrote about? I mean, we should keep this in the podcast. This is an organic interjection. I didn't connect the two. He was like running on I'll give your 11th kid, tax-free, whatever.
He wanted to give $1 billion to every baby in America.
And then he's like, now I'm going to behead Satan.
Beheads the statue of Satan. So this guy is, look, I'll just say, he's not your normal blue blazer Republican. Take it or leave it, but it's definitely something a little bit different.
I feel like this is going to raise his electoral prospects in, Mississippi? Louisiana?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a little. This is a display calling out to be vandalized, but I don't know how statesman-like it is. But who knows? We'll see.
I'm actually shocked by this. But we're talking about Mississippi here, and he was edged out of office basically by a Chamber of Commerce Republican being like, no, this is irresponsible spending. Vote me into office so I can cut your tax, whatever, typical stuff. Now he has another chance to go back and said, so I faced down Baphomet. I took down the Baal.
Yeah, it's just like, Christian, when he slew Apollyon on his way to the celestial city. We're living in Bunyan's America, baby. We're going to have big child bonuses and behead the Satan statues, I guess. So,
can I just comment on the statue front? So before I joined the wonderful Compact, I was basically like the statue correspondent for the Telegraph, the British newspaper. And so for this whole period of time, anytime anyone sort of spat at a statue or gave a dirty look to a statue or tried to pull them down, whether it was a slaver or a Confederate statue, I had to write a column. This was basically my job for a couple of years. And there's a very funny kind of Babylon Bee-esque point that people are making, is that if you simply put satanic horns on Confederate statues, then people will stop pulling them down, right? And I think this is the statue synthesis we need for America to heal itself, is to fuse the Confederate American history with Satanism and thus protect all the statues.
So just one last, on a serious note, Sam Moyn, whose piece you definitely should read. It's titled the liberal plot against democracy, is, among other things, he's the Chancellor Kent Professor of Law at Yale. That's notable because Chancellor Kent, who was a post-revolution, post-founding of the Republic jurist, very influential jurist, upheld a blasphemy charge as early as the 19th century. I'm not saying we should go back to upholding those kinds of blasphemy laws in that same way today. But just to bring all of our topics together, I'm pretty sure Chancellor Kent would be weirded out by a statue of Satan in a state house.
So now let's hear from the members of the Compact editorial staff, just recommending some of the films, books that they enjoyed over the last year. Extra points if it was actually issued in 2023. But we will accept one of the classics if you're just reading Mortimer Adler items. Nina, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. So being a girly SWAT, I stuck to the 2023 constraints. And it occurred to me one thing as I was preparing for this is really 2023 was the year of alternative media. And I would say the rise of a serious and persistent alternative to mainstream media, not only in terms of the figures for the mainstream kind of collapsing, but also in terms of the importance of the stories that are being broken by places like Compact, but also on Substack and other, alternative sites. So that was kind of my overriding feeling. And I spend a lot more time now, I would say, reading alternative media, however we want to describe it. And in terms of thinking about cinema, I'd like to mention, I guess, the work of Nathan Fielder, who for quite a few years now is really pushing the boat out. And this is going to be very A24 heavy, my selection. I have my issues with A24, but we have to say that they also do incredible work. So it's not finished yet, but Nathan Fielder's new series on called The Curse, which is, I would describe as a kind of gentrification horror. Is a scripted series, unlike his previous. Well, they're all scripted, but they have a different valence vis-a-vis reality and fiction. The Curse is more fiction oriented. It stars Emma Stone and Nathan Fielder, and it's just an incredibly awkward and painful, but very, very insightful account of the tensions between PMC oriented obsession with doing good, material reality, the economic constraints of what it actually means to be a good liberal in the housing market, and so on and so forth. And he's just amazing at this kind of creating this excruciating feeling. And he's introduced this note of horror, which I think is a new development in his work to some degree to keep it, to make it a persistent feature. And on the horror note, I mean, I know that Geoff is a big horror fan, but I have to mention another A24 hero who would be Ari Aster, whose film Beau is Afraid was out this year. It was not a box office success, but I would say it's a critical success in the sense that it's extremely experimental. I would say that Ari Aster is probably in the running for the first great millennial director. This is a film that deals with various dark currents around Oedipality, around the Longhouse, as the dissident right would call it. The first 20 minutes of this film is a devastating portrayal of the contemporary American city, in which all of the negative attributes are pushed to the max, and a genuinely horrifying depiction of the state of urban life in a way that only horror can do. And I think as a genre, we have to say that horror is the place where some of the most critical truths of our current moment are being revealed to the greatest degree. So I would say that Ari Aster is up there as this kind of, potentially first great millennial director. And of course, he's struggling with these Oedipal questions and these questions of what it means to be a man in a kind of increasingly feminized world, which is at the same time incredibly dangerous and incredibly kind of fearful. So The Curse and Beau is Afraid are my two visual suggestions. And I just wanted to make a note that alongside kind of counter media or the alternative media that I mentioned, I would say that poetry, there's a lot of really, really good poetry out there. I'd like to mention the work of Emilia Russo, who's one of our Compact contributors, who this year released a book called Magenta, which she dedicated to the public domain and released for free under her own editions, Asphalt Editions. And I would say Emily Russo's work is very interesting. It's very alchemical. She's referencing a lot of philosophers, a lot of medieval history. It's very cosmic, and it concerns questions of the soul and religion and so on. And yeah, so I'm a big fan of her work. And then just briefly, the other author is Sarah Fletcher, who's a British American writer who has a book out this year called Plus Ultra, which is a kind of a series of poems, prose poems. She's quite a young writer, published by Cheerio. And again, these texts are really quite, pushing the boat out, I guess, in terms of not only the use of language, but also kind of questions around sexuality, about what culture is, how we describe our experiences of beauty and so on. And my feeling increasingly as I age is how do we kind of resist the homogeneity of language in terms of our own speech, mimetic speech, but also in terms of the mechanization and the machine language of AI and ChatGPT and this kind of flood of banal language, right? So I think that poetry and maybe poetry and horror is where we find that those forms of resistance, without sounding too wussy about it. But I think there is something really serious going on. So those are my two book recommendations. So that's Emilia Russo and Sarah Fletcher.
In terms of, I try to limit to 2023 as well. Jacksonian histories for reasons that will hopefully become clear next year, but none of them was published in 2023. So in 2023, I read Michael Lind's Hell to Pay. It's a book about how wage suppression in the United States is the root of a lot, if not all, of our national problems, including, I think most brilliantly, he makes a very good case for wage precarity as being one great source of the woke phenomenon. Not the monocause, but one great source of the woke phenomenon, the idea that because we have a precarious economy in which you either have a degree to get that kind of job or you are utterly kind of desperate and plunged into, a financial abyss. If that's the choices you're facing, you're going to get a degree and you're going to try to fight on those identitarian grounds to get the kinds of jobs that come with those degrees, which our country doesn't produce enough anymore. But if we can have a more manufacturing-oriented economy, a lot of that pressure eases up. And the idea of being working or middle class does not equate to being just abjectly desperate and precarious. So Hell to Pay by Compact contributor Michael Lind. I also will just mention, film-wise, I'll mention two. Oppenheimer, to which I think I was needlessly cruel or critical on this podcast when we discussed it over the summer. Afterward, the more I thought about it, and then I rewatched it on home video. It's such an old-fashioned way of saying it, home video. It's a very strong movie. It's really richly textured about his personality. The idea that he was Oppenheimer persecuted, or did he kind of have what was coming, is not actually neatly answered by the movie on Oppenheimer's side, which was kind of one of my critiques the first time around. So that one. And then I have to say a movie that has utterly stayed with me, but I don't think is a good movie, is for me also Beau is Afraid. You cannot forget so much of what transpires in Beau is Afraid. And I'm a huge Ari Aster fan. It is self-indulgent. It goes on too long. I think the Oedipal Freudian points are so over the top, so sort of insultingly obvious that it's too much. Nevertheless, that opening sequence of him, just trying to make it out of the urban malaise that Nina briefly described is actually just utterly memorable and impossible to get over. And I keep thinking about it through the course of the year. So clearly Ari Aster has achieved something again. I think his two previous films, Midsommar and then the earlier Hereditary, are tighter and better ultimately. But he's clearly done something again, because I have not been able to stop thinking about that opening crawl through the sort of urban malaise. Only one point I would make is there's an open question whether or not Ari Aster is saying, here, through horror, I will reveal how badly our cities have become, or whether the shape of the city is in part the kind of Beau's own paranoid projection about, urban environments being these degraded, unsafe places all the time, feeding into kind of a right-wing paranoia about cities. And both can be true, right? I mean, statistically speaking, New York City is still much safer than it was in the late 80s and early 90s. And yet where I live, the quality of life has unquestionably declined in the way that Astor describes. At least I've seen it in an exaggerated way. Everywhere smells like pot. There's homeless everywhere. There's this general pervasive sense of insecurity and unhappiness in the cities. But it's, statistically speaking, as liberals would point out, it's not near as bad as it was in the late 80s and 90s. And that ambiguity about which of these two is what Beau is going through when he's walking through his own neighborhood is what, again, makes it a rich text, even as I think ultimately it's a very flawed movie.
Definitely, remarkable in its ambition and kind of grandiosity. It's certainly the most kind of aggressively Freudian movie made in some decades. There are a lot of movies that are that long that are just complete garbage and should not even be more than an hour and a half. This movie kind of gets away with being as long as it is, which I think speaks in favor of it. Somewhat relatedly, just on a kind of Freudian note, I guess the two nonfiction books I'd recommend are one called The Best Minds by Jonathan Rosen, and another called The Sullivanians by Alexander Still. I'll talk more about the latter because it's been less discussed. The Best Minds is a memoir of a friendship with of the author's friendship with a man who, was his childhood friend and neighbor, who grew up in a community not far from where I grew up in Westchester County, New York. We're both kind of high achieving academically, both went to Yale, and then his friend Michael has a severe schizophrenic breakdown in his young adulthood, and becomes a kind of advocate for for schizophrenics in the sort of anti-psychiatric mode. Kind of sees schizophrenics more as a kind of oppressed class who need to be liberated and who need to be whose condition needs to be destigmatized and accepted by society. He gets Yale Law School to go along with this narrative and allow him certain accommodations at a time when that wasn't very common. And he becomes a kind of prominent activist on behalf of, people with severe psychosis. And then he commits a horrifying murder. And so it's kind of about the, all of the moral conundrums and complications that this creates about what to do about people who, and how society should treat people who are severely mentally ill. And so it's a remarkable book. It's been, much praised and highly recommended. The Sullivanians, has a somewhat similar setting. It's basically about a group of kind of renegade psychoanalysts from a psychoanalytic institute on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And interestingly, there is a bit of overlap between the people who friend in The Best Minds, has these allies in the kind of renegade or anti-psychiatric sort of psychoanalytic movement. And, so there is actually overlap in terms of characters and personalities with the cast of characters in the Sullivanians. But the Sullivanians are these kind of radical psychoanalysts who decide that, in a similar manner to figures like, Deleuze and Guattari and, Foucault and others in this period, in various ways kind of conclude that the sort of Oedipal matrix of the family is kind of the source of all oppression and therefore needs to be kind of dismantled and deconstructed, right? Rather than simply, as the more conservative Freudian approach would have it, having people adjust to the expectations of the Oedipal structure, the structure itself needs to be dismantled. And so these psychoanalysts eventually, recruit various of their patients into this kind of experiment in communal living, and essentially attempts to abolish the family, in a slogan that's kind of become current again recently in some parts of the left. But this is back in the 1970s and 80s. They attempt to enact a kind of abolition of the family within this community of analysts and analysans and create what is in effect a kind of cult. And it is a cult that is oddly spread out across a number of apartment buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, is kind of existing in parallel with the kind of normal life of New York City. All these people are, many of them are sort of high achieving professionals and so on, and highly educated people. And, the results are pretty horrifying and disturbing. And, it reminded me of, Jacques Lacan's famous dictum, le père ou pire, In other words, the father or worse. And what you find is that this attempt to dismantle the oppressive Oedipal structure leads to something far worse and far more oppressive and horrifying than the vast majority of families could ever be. And so it's a remarkable book. The Sullivanians, I highly recommend it. It reads like a very strange, it's a stranger than fiction kind of nonfiction story. It's very disturbing and kind of anticipates a lot of these kind of odd zombified ideologies that the left kind of keeps rediscovering. It really shows you what happened when this idea of family abolition was put into practice, by these kind of highly educated and many of them seemingly quite well-meaning people. It's darkly funny quite a bit of the time in terms of the foibles of this kind of bizarre, kind of Woody Allen adjacent world, but where things go really off the deep end. So that's my recommendation. Both those books are wonderful. The Sullivanians, I think, didn't get as much acclaim as it deserved, and is worth reading alongside The Best Minds because of their overlap in terms of exploring how and these kind of radical theories of psychology led to attempts at radical social reform that really ended up backfiring in some quite disturbing ways.
I didn't really take in anything that was new to 2023, with one exception that I will just unapologetically mention here. Sohrab Ahmari's Tyranny Incorporated, I think an agenda-setting book, not just for Compact, but for political discussions more broadly, things we've been talking about, building a political program that can actually help to assemble a majority rather than resorting to kind of legal hijinks, actually addressing the needs of American workers, American voters. And this is what Tyranny Incorporated is about. I think a very challenging book for people on the right, but it takes really seriously certain things that people on the right do care about. How can we provide people with a living wage that helps them to form families, to buy homes? I mean, these are the concerns at the heart of the book. I do recommend it for yourself and for anyone else you're looking for a last minute gift for. Along with Tyranny Incorporated, I think one thing that kind of came out this year that I was just delighted to see was the Criterion Collection's new edition, Bud Bedeker's Westerns, starring Randolph Scott. This is brought up by the Criterion Collection under the name The Renown Westerns. Randolph Scott was a kind of overly handsome parlor cat leading man in Golden Age Hollywood. As he got older, though, his face became a little craggier and just more damaged by years of UVs. And in these Westerns, there are 5 of them. They're very kind of humble and sparse. They lack the kind of grand scope and certainly the budget of something like The Searchers. But what they achieve with by such economical means is really remarkable. Just the subtle shadings of character, the moral complexities, and also the stark visuals. They almost kind of remind me of stories you find Genesis that are just kind of bafflingly terse and suggestive. Things like Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, and then a goat is found in the bushes, or the demand when Moses is returning to Egypt to liberate his people. He's kind of stopped at one point, and an angel or God seems to come to him and demands that he circumcise his son. Strange, suggestive encounters. I think that without really aspiring to anything high, certainly not anything with kind of deep religious significance, these stories achieve a lot. And if you're someone who has enjoyed a Western, likes genre films that do something that seems to go beyond the genre, I really recommend The Renown Westerns, which Criterion just brought out in 4K Ultra HD Blu-rays, which treatment I think they fully merit, and they were hard to come by before, so that was great to see. The book that I read that I most enjoyed was The Nibelungenlied, a poem that's not much read. Having any medieval German, I read it in English. I used a verse translation, which, while imperfect because you can't really replicate the verse, the German verse forms in English, I thought helped convey the rhythm of the poem. it's just great story of kind of, again, just kind of weird and suggestive. There are these elements that seem kind of mythic, like Siegfried going into the marriage chamber of Kriemhild and helping Gunther, his friend, consummate the marriage. Just bizarre stuff. But really, that's all mixed in with this kind of the pomp and circumstance of the medieval court. I think that our whatever vague ideas we have of the Nibelungenlied are mediated through Wagner, and it really is not. It's really something altogether different from the Ring Cycle, which is of course great on its own terms. But I think that if you think that having seen the Ring Cycle that you've experienced the Nibelungenlied, really encourage you to take the poem on its own terms. It's very much a product of a medieval court culture. It was probably written by a poet in the court of the Bishop of Passau in Germany. So it's a poem that took the form in which we receive it. It took that form in the court of a bishop prince, and it reflects the religious and courtly ideology that you would expect from that context. So it's really a great and strange story with a incredibly kind of bloody Quentin Tarantino type ending. So worth checking out. With that, thanks, Geoff, Sohrab, Nina. Thanks to you listeners. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Enjoy time with friends and family, however you celebrate.